So from there, when we look at the urban TEA category, and this is probably the most important part, if there have been 2,849 applications, the average number of visas attached to each application is the critical assumption here, because that's what moves the needle in terms of how long the backlog is going to be. Historically, the number for India and China is about 2.8 to 2.9 visas per applicant. We're going to go down to 2.5 because this also does not take into account the denial rate, which some people will argue could be high, could be low. So we're going to use a moderate 2.5 times multiplier. Some people would use 3. We're going to use 2.5. But what that translates to is that the actual demand right now for urban TEA, if everybody that applied was approved today, there would be over 7,000 visas needed. Now, that doesn't really work with supply and demand when there's only 1,000 of these set-aside visas available per year. So with one rollover year, 2,000 visas. Now we are in a little bit of a surplus now because the last couple of years have had extra over the 10,000 visas per year. But steady state, and this is getting a little bit more advanced, there's 10,000 EB-5 visas available. 10% of those are set aside for the urban TEAs, the high unemployment urban TEAs. So 1,000 visas a year, and 20% are set aside for rural deals. And when you look at rural, even projecting out the future data, we come up with about 4,056 visas would be needed for those investors. And there's currently that many rural visas available. So as we're looking at it now, we can confidently say that based on this projection, rural is current. Now, new data may come out that shows more rural demand where there could be a slight backlog there as well, although we think it's unlikely that it's already there. But urban, we can very clearly see that there's many more years of demand for those visas than what are available. So our best estimate now is approximately 5+ year wait for an urban TEA for a new investor filing today from India or China. That's our best guess at the conclusion. Now, of course, things can change, and there's a lot of other factors that could make the picture much worse than this. But if you're an investor looking just using common sense assumptions, you very quickly see urban TEAs are not current anymore. On the visa bulletin, they are, because we need enough approvals for it to show a backlog. But there's very clearly more demand for that category than rural. So with that, there's a pretty simple assumption that depending on your personal situation and priorities, you need to take that into account. Now, for investors not from China, India, and several other high demand countries such as Taiwan, Vietnam, South Korea, and even others, urban could still be a great fit. If you're in the US and can adjust status and don't mind waiting 5+ years for your green card because you can get other benefits, sure, it could be a good fit. But what we would imagine is that for a majority of Chinese and Indian investors in other high demand countries, the rural is likely a better fit.
What's happened is kind of a twofold effect of you've got double the number of filings, right, in urban high unemployment, and yet you've got half the number of visas available. So what that's done is create a little bit of a shortage and a backlog that could be implemented anytime this year, right? We don't know exactly when it's going to hit, because one of the other things that a lot of folks don't understand is these numbers go in and USCIS counts the number of applications that are filed. They don't honestly know, right, how many people are being included in each application. And the visa bulletin doesn't change until the Department of State starts issuing green cards, whether it's at the consulate or here in the United States through adjustment of status. And unfortunately, the numbers are so low to work with, right? Urban high unemployment only gets 1,000 visas per year. The numbers are so low that a few hundred applications coming from non-India, non-China can take up a significant portion of the 1,000 visas that are available every year. And that's where this 5,000 visa shortage becomes even more troubling, I guess, for Chinese and Indian investors, because every visa that's given to a rest of world person takes away from the overall number available to people within the category, right? So if you're from one of the countries that's got a high number of filers, for example, China, you could be sitting in an even longer line than the 5-year backlog we're talking about here, because of how many visas still must be allotted to countries that don't have a high filing number.
Exactly. This is the slide that I wanted to focus on, because as we're talking about just projecting forward the last 3 months, if you look at how demand is growing, it's growing quickly. We're seeing the same thing on our side as what the lagging USCIS is showing, to where we don't think that it's realistic it just went forward at the same rate as the last 3 months. over the next 4 months. We think it is a significant step change higher in terms of overall demand. So the takeaway to us is urban TEAs have definitely been much more popular, and they've continued to be more popular. It's a little too late for the urban TEA set-asides to do what everybody thought they were going to do. That time has passed. Now, rural, of course, is not immune to that. But luckily, there's twice as many set-aside visas a year, and it has not been utilized at the same rate so far. So there's a lot more runway before we're going to have the same issue in rural.
Yep, and I think what Ahmed mentioned there in terms of approvals actually happening, I'm sure a lot of people think, oh, EB-5AN, we're focused on rural. Yes, because of these trends. But we do have urban projects as well. And of all of the investors who've filed I-526Es with EB-5AN so far in the last 2 years, we've gotten many I-526Es approved for rural projects. We don't have a single I-526E approval for an urban project. And we had over 100 or almost 100 of urban I-526Es in 2022 and 23, not a single one approved yet. So we're sure that other people in the industry are going to try and position this as, urban's still getting approved quickly, maybe overall, but we have a pretty big sample size and we haven't seen a single approval.
And we have two, to be clear, we have two approved exemplar 956Fs for urban projects with investors in those projects. And we're hoping very soon we get approvals for those 526Es, but we also have several 956F approvals on our rural deals, which were all filed much later than our urban deals. And we have approvals there on the individual investor 526Es. At the start of the RIA, like many other regional centers, we already had urban TEA deals ready. So our first several dozen investors all went into typical urban TEA projects, which is great, but we're still waiting on their approvals versus our investors that went into rural deals. And you'll get this confirmation from others in the industry and attorneys. Those petitions are being approved much faster. So next is about rural. So as of today in our projections, rural is still current. Now, it is possible that more people have filed in the last 4 months than what we predicted, and that's actually what we expect, and maybe more have gone to rural. So it could be close to rural getting a short backlog as well. We can't know that for sure, and we'll find out very soon. But what it does mean is that no matter what, there's at least a pretty significant window here where you can go into a rural deal and know that it is can currently file and likely no backlog. But if there is a backlog, it will still at least be a very short backlog just because of the amount of visas in that category being double and the usage hasn't been that high yet. And lastly, there are other high demand countries where urban TEAs might not be the right fit. That's more of an individual decision as more data comes out. But we know that China and India, the urban category is not really viable.